Hi guys, Bree Cheyenne checking in. Welcome back to my channel if you're welcoming back, and if you're new here, hello, I'm Bree. Welcome to my channel. We talk about all things crime, mysterious, things that are just creepy. So if that sounds like something you like or might like, hopefully you enjoyed this video and more to come. Yes, Lord knows it's been a while since I've uploaded a video, but honestly, I just wanted to take a break. That's all there is to it. I just wanted to take a break. So I'm back to making videos. Although I mainly really wanted to do, my mission was to do 2 videos a week. I've realized now that that just is not going to happen. It's probably going to be more like 1 video every week to every week and a half, 2 weeks. And yeah, that's all I have to say. I still don't like long intros, so I'm going to stop talking and go ahead and jump right into the video for you guys. If you notice, this is not like my other videos where I actually record myself. I'm doing this kind of more like a podcast type video because it's just easier to record it like this. Also, I completely lied. Sorry, this intro is going to be a little bit longer because I do have an announcement to make. Like I said, I'm still going to continue uploading videos on this channel, but I am launching a Patreon. Well, I have launched a Patreon. I'm going to leave the link in the description below. You can subscribe to the Patreon. I'm going to be uploading 1 podcast a week, and then you can see the different subscriptions with what you get with each one. So if you guys want to go ahead and support me on there, I would love you for it so much. But if you don't, still love you. Thank you for taking the time out to watch this. If you do watch this, I hope everyone has a great life. I'm going to stop talking now and just go ahead and jump into the video. But yeah, Patreon link in the description. Going to the video now. Bye. In today's video, I'm going to be telling you guys about the investor murders in Craig, Alaska. So this gruesome story took place in September of 1982 in the small town of Craig, Alaska, where commercial fishing is one of the top industries. And when I say small town of Craig, Alaska, I do mean small town. It's only a population of about 1,200 people. So during this time that this happened, salmon prices were at their highest, and captain and crewmen could earn really good money if they worked pretty hard during salmon season. So specifically, the date is September 5th, 1982, and Mark Coulthurst from Blaine, Washington, and also owner of a 58-foot purse seiner. So I'm outside editing this right now, and I just wanted to jump in here really quickly and say that I pronounced seiner wrong the first few times I said the word. I had no idea how it's pronounced when I looked it up, or I'm sorry, when I was doing the outline for the story and taking the notes and stuff. So I pronounced it wrong, and then something just told me in the middle of when I was recording this to look up the pronunciation for it, and I found out I was pronouncing it completely wrong, so ignore that. Named the Investor pulled into Craig, Alaska, and unloaded its recent catch of 77,000 pounds of pink salmon that was worth $33,000. However, Coulthurst wouldn't be paid for this or his other catches of the summer until the end of the season. The commercial fishing season had been temporarily closed by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, but it was scheduled to reopen the following day for the final salmon opening of 1982. The Investor was one of the most expensive high-tech commercial boats of its kind in the region, and Mark had just become the proud owner of it. Also on the Investor with Mark were his family, 3-month pregnant 28-year-old Irene, his wife, and their 2 children, 5-year-old Kimberly and 4-year-old John. Mark's crewmen on board were his 19-year-old cousin, Mike Stewart, 19-year-old Dean Moon, 19-year-old Jerome Keown, yes, Keown, I think so, and 18-year-old Chris Heyman. After unloading their catch, the crew pulled the Investor up to the North Cove dock. They tied the Investor to the Seiner Decade, which in turn had to be tied to the Seiner Defiant. This meant to get back and forth to the North Cove dock, the crew from the Investor had to climb across the decks of the other 2 boats, including, anyone that just wanted to get to the boat in general. Moon and Keown went ashore soon after they docked the boat, and according to troopers, the 2 men bought a small quantity of drugs from a friend by the name of John Kenneth Peel. Peel was one of Mark's crewmen on his previous boats, but he was now crewing for someone else. While on shore, Jerome Keown placed a call to his brother, and his brother later stated that Jerome sounded normal and didn't indicate that anything was wrong. Stewart and Heyman ended up leaving the boat together, but the troopers couldn't find any witnesses that remembered seeing them that night. Stewart made a call to his home in Bellingham, Washington, and was also noted as not sounding in distress. It's assumed that Mark didn't have any cash on the boat because he wrote a $100 check to a friend for cash. He was going out to celebrate his 28th birthday. He was taking his family out to dinner at Ruth Ann's restaurant. When later questioned, people at the restaurant reported that nothing unusual happened during the family dinner, but one witness said that John Kenneth Peele briefly stopped by at the family's table to talk to them, something that Peele later denied. The Coulthursts left the restaurant at approximately 9:30 p.m., and a crewman on the deck 8 remembered John, 4-year-old John, poking his head inside the pilot house to greet him when they were making their way back to the Investor. So during that night, a storm violently struck the dock, and the crew of the deck 8 celebrated the end of the salmon season with a pretty loud party. So with all the noise going on from that party, no one on the deck 8 or Defiance heard anything unusual, nor did they remember seeing anyone coming or going to the Investor. Remember, they had to climb over all those decks to get to the Investor, or all those docks, sorry. So around 6 a.m. the next morning, a deck 8 crewman saw the Investor slowly idling away from the dock. He noticed they had inexplicably left their expensive tie-down lines on the deck of the deck 8. These lines were normally retrieved and stored on board until they were needed again. So the deck 8's crewman said that they waved at a man in the Investor's pilot house, and the man waved back. A few minutes later, another deck 8 crew member came out on the deck and saw a man on the deck of the Investor. So at 7:30 a.m., a crewman on another boat saw the Investor anchored across the harbor from Craig near a place called Fish Egg Island. So around that same time, another witness claimed to see the skiff from the Investor tied to a cold storage dock. And by 10:30 a.m., heavy fog started to roll into Craig, which started to obscure the Investor from everyone. So as the fishing fleet started to prepare for the salmon opening that was later in that day, the Investor was out of sight, out of mind to everyone. The Investor's skiff, however, was in the way of the cold storage dock and had to be moved several times during the day. The captain of the deck 8 thought the Investor left the dock because of the noise from their party, so he radioed the Investor to apologize. He didn't receive a reply, and as the boats began heading out for the salmon opening, the fog that remained was so thick that most captains had to use radar to navigate. The next morning, now September 7th, the fog was finally clear, and observers in Craig were surprised to see the Investor still anchored near Fish Egg Island, not wondering why Mark hadn't gone fishing with the rest of the fleet. Witness claimed to see a young man purchasing 2.5 gallons of gasoline in Craig, climbing into the Investor's skiff with the gasoline and motoring out to the Investor. So at 4 p.m., the crew of another boat by the name of Casino noticed smoke rising from the Investor. After alerting authorities, the Casino crew headed toward the Investor to offer any assistance. On the way, the captain of the Casino reportedly saw the Investor's skiff leave the Investor and accelerate towards Craig. The captain nearly had to ram the skiff to make it stop, and when he asked if there were people on the burning boat, the operator said, "Yeah, there's people on the boat," and then he sped toward Craig. Crazy. That just sounds, I don't know, that's just creepy to me. Like, that just creeped me out. Once the man in the Investor's skiff reached the Craig dock, he apparently spoke to at least 3 people before he went into town and went about his way. Lee Axemaker, who was the former Craig mayor, said, "I saw the guy in the skiff. He was a cool character. He came up, talked to a few people, made a phone call, and left." A state trooper investigator described the man as slipping into a time warp at the end of the dock. By the time the Casino reached it, the Investor was fully engulfed in flames and much too dangerous for the crew to help. Alaska State Trooper Bob Anderson was the first law enforcement official that arrived on the scene. No one in Craig had the proper equipment to put out a fire on the water, so the responders issued a mayday call, and nearly 2 hours later, one small pump was supplied by a tugboat and it started spraying fire on the water. Fire on the water. Excuse me, my dumbass meant to say water on the fire. The Coast Guard was eventually contacted to airlift additional supplies to the scene because that one small pump was not cutting it. Trooper Anderson returned to Craig and called his sergeant. He told him that the fire was spreading so quickly he was sure it was arson. Accordingly, his sergeant employed an arson investigator. At 7:30 p.m., the tugboat captain radioed the Coast Guard to inform them that the fire was now under control. Everything was all good, or so they thought. Anderson returned to the Investor and found it burned severely. He and a few others searched the boat, or what was left of it, and they found the charred remains of 4 people. The remains were eventually identified as Mark, his wife Irene, their daughter Kimberly, and Mark's cousin Mike Stewart. Aside from the burning, they also all had multiple gunshot wounds. As soon as the 4 bodies were removed from the boat, it burned again. The fire started up again, and then it destroyed the rest of the cabin. Back in Craig, a police officer told Anderson he had interviewed a witness who saw the suspicious man in the Investor's skiff. This witness said that the man was 20 or 21 years old with light brown or blonde hair. They estimated his weight between 150 to 160 pounds and noted that he was wearing glasses and a baseball cap with a logo on it. Since the man was seated, the witness couldn't guess his height. The following morning, 2 more law enforcement officials arrived. The fire was still burning at this time, so the troopers summoned a helicopter that was used for fighting forest fires so they could get it to dump just a bunch of water on the boat. The boat was also starting to lean to one side, so the officers decided to tow it ashore, and they left it there until the arson investigator could come and examine it. But the boat was left completely unattended, so basically anyone could have come and messed with it if they wanted to. It's also likely that the rising tides destroyed at least some of the evidence, if not the rest of that was left. Upon the completion of their investigation of the Investor, the arson investigator discovered some more bone fragments. They were eventually identified as belonging to Jerome Keown. However, it was never determined whether the remaining bone fragments belonged to either Chris Heyman or Dean Moon, and the remains of John Coulthurst were never found. Investigators believe that John was just so small his body was completely incinerated, which is just so sad. Investigators didn't believe the killer was one of the unidentified crew members because eyewitnesses were certain the man they saw operating the skiff was not a member of the Investor's crew. Neither Chris Heyman nor Dean Moon were ever seen again after the fire, and they were presumed dead. The police concluded that 8 people had been murdered on the Investor. So the investigation was off to a bad start because police weren't able to extinguish the fire until the day after it started, which left no forensic evidence behind. They also couldn't even be certain how many victims there were. Upon being informed that the skiff seen leaving the burning boat was tied at the cold storage unit dock, the responding officer examined it very briefly. He decided that the rain would have washed away any fingerprints, so impounding the boat to look at it more closely just would have been a waste of time. Completely unaware that it belonged to the Investor. He didn't even know that. The only evidence law enforcement had was from eyewitnesses in the small town of Craig, who gave descriptions of the man that brought the gasoline and sped away from the Investor in the skiff. Given that during this time there is an influx of people due to the salmon season, this man could have very well been a stranger to Craig, as the descriptions were pretty vague. I mean, I would imagine them to be like if he's wearing sunglasses, baseball cap, all that stuff, you know? Investigators believe that the crew members of the Investor were killed 1 or 2 at a time as they returned to the boat that night. They determined that Mark, Irene, and Kimberly and Mike Stewart were all shot with a .22 caliber weapon. And the massacre started not long after they returned home from dinner because Irene was still in the same clothes that she wore to the restaurant. They believed that the killer remained on the boat the entire night, and then when the next morning came, he moved the Investor to Fish Egg Island, where he then anchored it in deep water and opened the seacocks, hoping that it would sink the boat. He must have been real shocked when he returned to see that the Investor was still floating after the fog cleared. Subsequently, he purchased the gasoline, took the skiff back to the Investor, and set it aflame. Authorities investigated leads for over a year without many answers, honestly. They had a stroke of luck finally when they released a sketch of the man in the Investor's skiff when the fire began. Several fishermen came forward to say they recognized the man and identified him as John Kenneth Peel, the crewmen who once worked for Mark, and also the man who supposed witnesses say they saw at the restaurant, and also the one the two bought the drugs from, you know, him. Also, the boat Peele was working on was docked in Craig at the time. So nearly 2 years exactly to the date of the murders, Peele was arrested in September of 1984, and in January of 1996, his trial began. Now, due to strong oppositions between both the prosecution and the defense, this hostility continued to spill over into the 6-month-long trial, which is the longest one in Alaskan history. The state admitted that they only had circumstantial evidence against Peele, and the evidence being witnesses who either claimed they saw Peele in the skiff or saw him purchase gasoline before the fire started. 2 former co-workers of Peele reported a statement Peele allegedly made a year after the murders, where they claimed he admitted to them he had murdered the crew of the Investor. In the end, their claims weren't really trustworthy, though. The prosecution painted Peele's motive as revenge for Mark firing him a year prior. Peele's defense attorney picked apart the notoriously unreliable eyewitness testimony, especially because, like, you know, it's so long now, years later, like, no. They pointed out inconsistencies, including some witnesses changing their stories, as well as not remembering the events that took place 4 years ago. The defense, hold on, before I start getting into that, that's the one thing I always think about. I'm like, yo, what if I get arrested for something I did not do? And they were like, where were you doing on this day? Da, 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 da. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I do not know. The defense also suggested the killings were the result of a drug deal gone bad, but there was never any evidence introduced to prove this. The authorities and district attorney stated early on in the investigation that drugs were not involved in the murders, but nonetheless, rumors continued to flow, suggesting otherwise. However, the Coulthursts were not well known in the area, as they didn't deliver their fish to the cannery in Craig often. They probably only did so this one time because they were on their way back home to Washington. Also, the fact that this young man owned this nice, big, luxurious, expensive boat, so people also kind of started speculating that he might have been involved in drugs for that reason too. They also speculated that either Heyman or Moon could have been responsible, since their remains were never identified. According to authorities, no evidence proved that they escaped, so they were presumed dead. Although, what evidence would you really find of someone escaping? I'm not really sure. So after 6 months of testimony, the jurors deliberated 6 days before returning deadlocked, and that resulted in a mistrial. But the state didn't let that stop them, and they brought Peele back to trial 2 years later. The second trial only lasted 3 months, as this time the defense declined to provide any witnesses after the prosecution laid out their case. The jury deliberated 4 days before returning with an acquittal for both charges of murder and arson. State officials insist that Peele murdered Mark, his family, and crew, but they just don't have the direct evidence to prove it. No one else has ever been charged with the 1982 massacre, and in 1990, Peele sued the state of Alaska for $175 million for wrongful prosecution. This was based on a 1984 memo from one of the lead investigators, where he indicated that there was no direct evidence tying Peele to the crime. 7 years later, he received a $900,000 settlement, and he has maintained his innocence, saying somebody out there knows something, but I guess it just ain't him. Thank you guys so much for staying with me this entire way. If you watched this entire video, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll be back with more, and hopefully you will too. Thank you. Bye.